All right, well, welcome to Milwaukee Seltzer Saturday for this month. Today's topic is time-dependent actions or automation and flow. I'm assuming you come here mainly because you had the same question I did of, okay, we're moving things from workflows and process builders over to flow. How do I put my time dependencies into those flows so that they work the same? And it's actually relatively easy. But before we actually go that, we're going to talk about a couple of different types of automation or time dependent actions in flow. The first one is schedules. So with a schedule, basically you can create a scheduled flow and allows you on a daily basis or weekly to look for some type of condition in all records. And if that condition is met in those records, you can execute an action. And it looks a little like this. So you have your schedule, you select your start date, the time you want to fire, and then you can select the frequency. So once daily or weekly. Once that's selected, then your actions will be met. So you can also set your conditions, and then whatever that gets met for that particular thing, and then it will fire those particular actions for that flow. That's the more known one is how to do those schedule flows. The other one is paths, and this is what I'm going to focus a bit more heavily on today, which is the lesser known of the ones that you can do out there. So typically with a path, the you're looking for a condition, and when that condition is met, you want to do something, which could be like a field updates, an email, but you want to do it on a delay, so it needs to take place at a later point in time. So with that, what we do is we set up paths for that. So when you use a trigger flow with a path, this is actually kind of what a sample one will look like. I have a little use case here that we're going to walk through. So a user will receive an email 1 hour after a case is created if the status is still new. This is what the end product will look like. So we have our starting point right here. And we have our, everyone's fairly familiar with the run immediately path. That's what happens when that condition is being met. It just fires whatever the flow tells it to do. We're going to talk about the other side here with paths. And we can actually have more than one path per flow. But I'll talk about some pitfalls of having multiple paths in there and what are some good recommendations to do that in a little bit there. But essentially, the record gets triggered. We set some type of a path here, and we can set the time delineation for whatever we want on that. And then it goes down that path and that set amount of time that you've identified. So if it's an hour from the start, it's going to wait an hour, then it's going to run down this path and figure out what needs to happen for that particular flow. So first things first, in our scenario for our use case here, we are creating a uh, email alert. So I always like to make my email alerts. So before we do that, create the email template. I am also going to use the alert email alert function. So I'm going to go ahead and create my email alerts and my email templates before I actually go ahead and create my flow. So that's my first thing that I'm going to do first. Once I have that built, I'm going to move on to creating my flow. And this is a record triggered flow. And I'm going to select my object, which is a case. And I'm also specifying my initial status of the case is equal to new. One thing to note when we do flows, if you have a very open initial a bunch of uh, pass firing that don't need to be fired because there are some limits around that. So our first thing here, we set up our path, which is 1 hour. So we give it a label, we give it a name, we specify the time source when a case is created is what we select for this. So basically case is created, we're going to say an hour after that is done, we're going to send this flow on this path to execute any actions that are in this path. I've also put a decision element within my path because I want to verify an hour from the initial creation of that case that the status is still new. So if the status is no longer new, I don't want to send out the email alert. So if it's changed within an hour, we want to verify that the status still is new. And if it's still new, then we're going to go ahead and fire our email. If it's not new, we're going to skip that result and go do nothing. because we don't need to do anything. So we're looking to see if our case still is in new status in this particular scenario. If you don't want to do that decision, you just want that action to fire an hour from now, you can just skip that decision output and it's just going to fire whatever is on that path. So this is one thing to note. If you don't care to reevaluate the criteria like most workflow rules did, you can skip that decision element. It's just going to go ahead and do its thing. And then I just have my email alert. I'm using email action to call that particular email alert that I created beforehand, and then I just assign the record ID to it so it knows which values to pull from when it sends that email alert out. Some of the best practices I just want to point out, make sure you use that initial criteria because, like I said before, there are some limits, and limits are right here. You could have up to 2,500,000 scheduled path interviews in a 24-hour period. That's the amount that you can have, or the number of license in your org multiplied by 200, whichever is greater is what you get. So you want to be careful with that because you don't want to create paths that don't do anything. So set that initial criteria is really beneficial, so that way you don't trigger flows and paths in here that don't need to be triggered. It's also not recommended to use a single flow for all your different time triggered actions. If the initial criteria is the same and you want to have different paths, like if the initial criteria was cases new and you want to send an email out 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 days, something like that, you could use that initial criteria for that flow and then have all the different time paths because you can have more than one path per flow. But if that initial criteria is too broad and you have a bunch of different other conditions that within that flow, you could cause undesired effects and essentially use up all your path interviews for flows that don't need to be triggered. All right, so yeah, we'll hop on over here and we can actually we'll look at the scheduled flow first, just because it's a little bit of the easier ones. If you've never set one up, you may be wondering how you can actually do that. Now, actually just go ahead and click new flow for everyone. From here, the scheduled flow, it's this particular one, and it's pretty, walks you through the steps pretty well. You're gonna first set your schedule. So this is when you want to fire. You can say, I want to start it today, and we can say we're gonna start it at, we'll go 10 o'clock my time. And the frequency, we can specify once, daily, weekly. Once means that today, it would only fire today at 10 o'clock, it'll never fire again. Daily means that starting today, every day at 10 o'clock, this flow will fire. And we select weekly. I can say starting today, every week or every Saturday, fire this particular flow to do whatever actions you have specified. So you set the schedule, and then you select your object. I can say case in this scenario. And then you can set your conditions, and the conditions are going to be whatever you want it to be. So I can say I'm looking for all cases where the status equals closed. But maybe I also want to say those last modified, and the account ID equals a specific account. So we could look for some types of account and then fire the action. So let's just say we're going to look for a case where all the status equals closed. And then once that's met, we can fire some action. So we can do assignments, we can do decisions, you can do everything in your flow that you normally do. We can go execute actions based on the initial criteria from your scheduled flow. Any questions around scheduled flows? And then to create the trigger flow, the record trigger flows, I'm going to go with the record trigger flow here, and we're going to use path. And I'm going to select the object of case, since this is our common one we have. I'm going to do one that's created. And I'm going to specify the entry criteria of that status of equals new. So this is my initial start of the flow. If the status equals new on save, it's going to go ahead and launch this particular flow. We have our one immediately. That's the default one. But if I want to add a path, I can go here and click the add scheduled paths. And like I said, we can go ahead and do that 1 hour again. And then we can select a time source. So these are the different fields we can reference. We can go off of when a case is created, when the close date, create date, or modify date. So I'll go when case is created, and then we can specify the number and then the hours and minutes before. So you can get a little more granular than you could with workflow rules and process builders. You don't have to do any of those weird format fields. You can be a lot more granular. So I can say 1 hour after this, and be done. You can always come back in here and I can also edit this and add another path. So I can say like 3 hour from where the case is created and still 3 hours. So you can have multiple paths per flow. So now you can see I have all these different paths and I can do whatever I need to do per path. So the way this would work, the case gets created, status equals new. Any of my immediate action is going to run right away. Then it's going to wait an hour and look for the hour. And then an hour is going to run these actions. And then in 3 hours, it's going to run any of these actions. So I put those decision elements in here again, just because I want to verify that I'm only sending that particular email when the case is still in the new status. Otherwise, it's just going to fire the action. So you may inadvertently send something. It really depends on your use case for that particular time. Yes, Marissa.
Sorry, I raised my hand prematurely. You answered the question. Thanks.
Okay. What was your question, just out of curiosity?
Well, it was only I was looking at when you created the three paths, it's not going to be three separate actions. It's only going to be when the record is created, right? So that's like the top level.
Yep. So this is only when a record gets created. So when a record gets created, these three paths can be set if that condition is being met. You can modify this to be like edited as well. So that can be like created or edited. That means anytime that status would be equal new, it would be triggered. So you have to be mindful of how you're going to do this because you don't want to keep updating things. You probably want to set your entry criteria here, and then also only when this is meant to meet the conditions because you don't want to keep triggering that to fire.
Yeah.
For existing records. But once you have that set up, it's going to run these actions and then it's going to run this in an hour and run this in an hour. That's where I was like, you want to be mindful of creating, if you have multiple paths on a record trigger flow, that you want to make sure this condition, your initial condition, is actually is the starting point for all these flows. Because if you create 5 records, that means you have 1, 2, that means you have 10 flow interviews and the waiting to be fired at a future point in time.
Yeah.
And if that is your desired output, that's fine, but we don't want to do this for closed cases. So we don't want to put our condition or our decision down here is the status new down here. We only wanted to fire on that initial criteria. And that's the kind of key thing you want to keep in mind here, because I've seen some flows where people put a bunch of paths in here and like, why am I hitting my limits? And they're like, I'm come back and be like, well, it's because every single record you create creates a 1 hour, a 3 hour, a 2 day, and they just sit there until they're executed. And I'm like, do they need to be there? Like, well, no, they shouldn't be firing for those. I'm like, well, it is because they put their decision on these parts. So it still consumes a path interview in the system, even though it's unnecessary. So I'm like, yeah, go back to the drawing board. Basically, we split up all of those paths into single record trigger flows for each one. And one thing to note is once you have your bunch of flows built out, I'm going to go ahead and leave this because I have that. Don't be afraid of your flow trigger explorer if you're trying to figure out where everything is set. So I'm going to look at a case created. You can see I have my email case flow there. This will show you all the different flows for that particular record when the case is created. You can also change this to like updated, deleted, so you can see the different flows by record, and you can see how they're being fired. One other thing to know, if you want to set them in order, if you go to your settings here and you go to the advanced settings, you can actually specify the trigger order. So you can tell the system which flow should fire first. So I can say no 1. So this would be the first one that we'd fire, and then the next flow I create, I could label 2 and so forth. So you can tell it the order in which you want them to fire. Otherwise, it's just going to fire based on the date of the creation of the flow. Any questions around that? I always like the flow trigger explorer because this kind of is like if you're used to process builders, this to me is like your old process builder. It tells you what's going on. So if you think about a process builder, when a case is created, this is your case created process builder. It just breaks it down by flow, and these are all just your little blue diamonds, your decision points, and then what your actions are right away for them. So this is kind of a super process builder that just sums everything up for each one of your flows. And my take on it. If you want to draw some associations from previous automation tools to the Flow and Flow Trigger Explorer.